When you seek a development approval in New South Wales, you're stepping into a very complex layered legal system. So the government introduced a system that appears, at least in principle, to be a one-stop shop. Under the current framework, the EP&A Act governs both development consents and construction approval, although they do remain like distinct stages in the approval journey. If you miss one of the requirements, then you're back to the standard DA plus CC pathway. If you can understand how these parts move together, you'll be able to move through the system with clarity, confidence, and far fewer surprises. Hi everyone, welcome to the Property Development Unpacked Show. My name is Goran, I'm your host, and today we're talking about a very interesting subject. It's all about the planning rules and regulations. When you seek a development approval in New South Wales, you're stepping into a very complex layered legal system, one that balances policy and statutory power, planning theory, and public interest. It's not just about submitting a development application or dealing with council officers. It's about navigating a legal regime built from decades of legislative evolution. At the center of this system is the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act 1979, commonly known as the EP&A Act. This piece of legislation governs almost every aspect of the land use planning in New South Wales. And when it first came into force in 1979, its primary function was to control land use through zoning and planning mechanisms. However, since 1st of July 1998, it has also incorporated building certification, bridging the planning and construction approval process into a more integrated framework. And before this integration, developers would engage separately with local councils for planning consent and building approval. Now you'd have one department assess your development application and another, often entirely separate, evaluate your construction plans. Communication between these departments could be inconsistent, leading to a patchwork of approvals and at times contradicting conditions. A development might be permitted under planning controls but denied under building codes, or vice versa. This disjointed structure was inefficient and frankly maddening for applicants and practitioners alike. So the government introduced a system that appears, at least in principle, to be a one-stop shop. Under the current framework, the EP&A Act governs both development consents and construction approval, although they do remain like distinct stages in the approval journey. So the first stage, which is the planning approval, is what we commonly refer to when we talk about lodging a DA. This is where you apply for what's known as development consent, and the second stage is building approval, which takes the form of either a construction certificate or in some cases a compliant development certificate. You cannot commence physical building works without this second level approval, even if your DA has been granted. Now, to understand how this operates in practice, we must examine the structure of legal authority established under the Act. At the top of the New South Wales Parliament enacts the legislation. The Minister for Planning administers the Act and oversees the policy direction. The Department of Planning, Housing and Infrastructure acts as both the policy engine and regulatory guardian. Now, the local council function as the frontline decision makers for most applications. The Department of Planning, Housing and Infrastructure acts as both the policy engine and the regulatory guardian. The local councils function as the frontline decision makers for most applications. And finally, the land environment courts serve as the judicial body that resolves disputes and appeals, acting as both a tribunal and in more complex matters as the court of record. Now, what gives shape to the Act in day-to-day development are the planning instruments it enables. These instruments dictate what can be built, where it can be built, and how it must be designed. Now, the state environmental planning policies, or the SEPs, are created by the minister and can override local controls, especially in matters of state interest such as housing supply, infrastructure corridors, or environmental conservation. Local environmental plans, or LEPs, are created by councils and codify local zoning, permissible land uses like height control restrictions, floor space ratios, and other core planning controls. And then there are the development plans, or the DCPs, documents also created by councils that provide design guidance but do not carry statutory weight. See, the DCPs are policy, not law. They're often enforced with enthusiasm by local planners, but legally they can be varied or challenged. So when you prepare your DA, you're submitting it with a web of instruments. SEPs may open up density where local LEPs limit it. DCPs might suggest setbacks or materiality choices, but you may legally propose alternatives if you can justify them. So most developers operate within the LDP and the DCP controls when SEPs apply, especially those relating to low and mid-rise housing or transport-oriented development. They override local discretion, and that's not a recommendation, it's the law. So when a council grants a development consent, that consent will come with conditions. This may be standard, applying to all developments, or a certain class, or they may be specific to your site. If your DA is refused, or if it's approved with conditions you believe are unfair or unworkable, you have the right to appeal to the Land Environment Court. Most such appeals are what we call merit reviews. These are not legal challenges but factual reconsiderations of the proposal against the planning instrument. See, in rare cases where legal error is alleged, such as misapplication or a zoning law or procedure failure, you may appeal on a point of law to a higher court. It is worth knowing that the EP&A Act is divided into parts, and each dealing with a different type of development pathway. The most common is Part 4, which applies to private development assessed by local councils. This is where the bulk of residential and commercial projects sit. Then there's Part 5, which applies when public authorities like local governments or agencies undertake development without submitting a DA. Now, in these cases, they must instead prepare environmental assessment of often an environmental impact statement rather than statement of environmental effects. Statement of environmental effects is common for Part 4. There's also what once was known as Part 3A, now superseded by Part 5.1 and the State Significant Development Pathway. These parts apply to infrastructure projects or developments of critical state significance. In such cases, the decision maker is not council, but the minister or their delegate. Now, understanding which part applies to your development is absolutely crucial. And if you're lodging a DA for a mid-rise apartment building, you're almost certainly under Part 4. And if you're building a school or a government agency, you might fall under Part 5. If you're proposing a major infrastructure node or urban renewal precinct, you may be declared as state significant and assessed under Part 5.1. Once you receive a developing consent, your next step is to secure a construction certificate or compliant development certificate. A CC confirms that your building plans align with the National Construction Code, formerly known as the Building Code of Australia, and that all DA conditions have been appropriately addressed. A CDC is available for projects that meet all pre-specified development standards. It's a fast-track process with strict criteria. If you miss one of the requirements, then you're back to the standard DA plus CC pathway. So it's not that easy, but it's very helpful if you know how it works and you know where you can implement it. So it's also important to know that if a council fails to determine your application within the statutory time frame, the law treats this as a deemed refusal, and then you can appeal to the Land Environment Court just as if your application had been formally refused. The appeal process is structured, but it's also nuanced. The court operates as a specialist tribunal with both planning and legal expertise. It, it reviews facts, reassesses applications, and if necessary, rules on legal points. But this is not simply a relitigation. It's a fresh evaluation, often faster and more efficient than many believe. Now, in summary, understanding the New South Wales planning system is less about memorizing laws and more about understanding power, process, and the instrument that shapes the outcome. The EP&A Act is the backbone, the planning instruments and its arms and legs, councils, departments, and the court give it in light. If you can understand how these parts move together, you'll be able to move through the system with clarity, confidence, and far fewer surprises. Because the development law is not the obstacle, it's the blueprint. And as always, life is exactly what you did to make it. Fortune favors the bold.